The nails had barely cooled in the wood when something invisible began to tick. It was the spring of AD 33, a swift execution on the dusty edge of the empire, designed to restore order, secure tax flow, and keep Rome's control over a restless province intact. Those who approved it, a governor hiding behind a basin of water, priests wrapped in linen and authority, and a distant emperor slowly dissolving into isolation, convinced themselves the matter was finished. Just another carpenter's body on a Judean hill. They believed they had crushed a movement at its birth. They were wrong. What they had actually done was inscribe their names into a ledger of death. There was no curse, no thunder, no divine intervention. What followed was something far colder. Politics. The empire they served began turning inward against its own architects. Fortunes were stripped overnight. Men were found suffocated in their beds. Names erased from senatorial records. Exile sent others to distant islands where madness arrived before ships. Some were killed by the very guards they had trusted. The silence created by that single execution slowly mutated into paranoia, climbing the imperial hierarchy, consuming everyone tied to the decision. This is the slow unraveling of the men who ruled the ancient world. Emperors, governors, and high priests who believed they controlled the machine, only to discover the machine always consumes its operators in the end. There was no supernatural judgment, no cosmic punishment. What came instead was something far more efficient, the machinery of power itself. Rome did not forget. It recalculated, and every man involved in that decision eventually discovered the same truth. Political violence never ends at its target. It travels backward through every hand that enabled it. Pontius Pilate believed the matter in Judea was closed. A single execution, approved under pressure, meant stability. Order restored, reports balanced, but Pilate was not serving a stable emperor. He was serving a decaying system, ruled from isolation by Tiberius Caesar, a man who had abandoned Rome itself and retreated to a private island fortress off the coast of Italy. Capri was not a palace in any traditional sense. It was a sealed command post of paranoia, a place where decisions were made in silence, and where proximity to power became the fastest route to death. Tiberius no longer governed through persuasion or presence. He governed through suspicion. Every senator was a potential traitor. Every message a possible deception. Every loyalty temporary. In that environment, survival depended not on competence, but on invisibility. Pilate's authority in Judea existed only as long as the court in Capri remained stable. But stability in Rome no longer existed. Only delayed collapse. The province he governed was treated like a revenue zone inside a vast extraction system. Judea produced little, but it consumed military attention, administrative effort, and political risk. Pilate's role was simple on paper: collect revenue and suppress disorder. In reality, it meant managing a population that refused full control, while reporting to an emperor who punished failure with death rather than dismissal. And the worst part was the delay. Orders took weeks to travel across the empire. By the time instructions arrived, the political reality that produced them was already gone. So every decision Pilate made was a guess about a world that no longer existed by the time Rome responded. That delay created a constant, low-level poison across the system. No one ever truly knew who was in power, or who would be alive when the next message arrived. And in the center of that instability sat a man who believed he was simply maintaining order. The man whose authority cast the longest shadow over Pilate was Tiberius Caesar Augustus. By the time of these events, He was already 74 years old, physically deteriorating, politically withdrawn from Rome itself. He had left the capital behind and retreated to the island of Capri, a steep, isolated piece of limestone in the Mediterranean that functioned less like a residence and more like a fortified observation post over an empire he no longer trusted. From Villa Jovis, perched above cliffs that dropped nearly 1,000 feet into the sea, Tiberius ruled through distance. Access to him was restricted, filtered, and dangerous. He did not hold court in the traditional sense. He processed information. And what he saw convinced him of one thing. Nearly everyone around him was either incompetent, disloyal, or actively plotting against him. This belief became the foundation of imperial governance. The system evolved into one built on accusation. Informants were rewarded. Suspicion was currency. Loyalty was constantly re-evaluated. A legal structure grew around this atmosphere. The treason trials, where almost anything could be interpreted as a threat to the emperor. A gesture, a coin, a remark, a coincidence. All of it could become evidence. No one in the elite class felt safe. Families turned on each other. Senators denounced colleagues. Slaves reported masters. Entire careers were destroyed based on interpretation rather than proof. And behind it all sat a financial incentive system. Accusers often received a portion of confiscated property from the condemned. This turned fear into profit. It also ensured that suspicion would never stop spreading. Pilate, operating in Judea, existed inside the downstream pressure of this system. Every report he sent could be interpreted as weakness, every failure as disloyalty, every disturbance as political liability. And somewhere far above him, on an island surrounded by cliffs and silence, an aging emperor shaped by paranoia made decisions that could erase a man from history without ever seeing his face. Pilate's real danger did not come from Judea itself. It came from the structure above him. His authority was not purely imperial. It was tied to a single man in Rome, Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, and, in practice, the gatekeeper of the emperor. Sejanus had quietly built a parallel power system inside Rome. While Tiberius withdrew further into Capri, Sejanus consolidated influence in the capital, placing loyalists across administrative positions throughout the empire, controlling access, controlling information, controlling proximity to power itself. Pilate was one of those appointees, which meant his position was not only administrative, it was political, and more importantly, it was conditional. For years, this structure held in silence, but imperial systems built on hidden power rarely remain stable. Eventually, Tiberius received evidence that Sejanus was preparing something far beyond loyalty, a move toward control of the state itself. The response was immediate, precise, absolute. Sejanus was summoned under the illusion of honor. He entered the Senate expecting elevation, perhaps even expanded authority. Instead, a letter from Capri was read aloud, and in it, Tiberius named him a traitor. The shift was instant. The system reversed itself in real time. Guards arrested Sejanus in the same chamber where he had once commanded fear. He was executed the same day. His body was publicly destroyed, dragged through Rome, and erased as a warning. And with his death, the entire network built around him collapsed overnight. Every official connected to Sejanus was now exposed, including Pilate. Because in Rome, protection is never permanent. It only exists as long as the man above you survives. And once he falls, everyone beneath him becomes evidence. From that moment on, Pilate was no longer shielded by power. He was simply marked by it. When the confrontation over Jesus of Nazareth reached Pilate, it was not a theological dispute. It was a political trap. The accusation was constructed with precision, not to describe a crime, but to trigger Roman fear. The charge was framed in a way that implied instability, sedition, potential unrest, the exact kind of situation that could be reported back to Rome as administrative failure. And in the imperial system, failure was never neutral. It was interpreted. A governor who allowed disorder risked being reclassified, not as ineffective, but as disloyal. Pilate understood this completely. He was not dealing with one man. He was dealing with a province under tension, a volatile population, and a political structure where every escalation could become a report that traveled back to Rome. And in Rome, reports became judgment. The pressure did not come from morality. It came from visibility. Because visibility in the imperial system was dangerous, the crowd intensified the calculation. Religious leadership demanded execution. Refusal risked unrest. Approval risked political consequences in another direction. There was no neutral option, only different forms of risk. Pilate attempted to distance himself from responsibility, to shift the decision, to delay it, to redirect it. But the system offered no escape position. Every refusal was still a decision, every delay still a choice, and every choice still had consequences. Eventually, he made the calculation common to Roman administrators in unstable provinces: minimize immediate disturbance, reduce escalation, preserve the report. The execution was approved, not because it was simple, but because every available outcome carried political risk. And in that structure, he chose the option that reduced immediate volatility. What he did not see was that this moment would not remain local. It would become part of a chain, one that would extend far beyond Judea, beyond his career, and far beyond the system that produced him. The execution in Judea did not register in Rome as a moment of consequence. Not at first. To the imperial center, it was routine. Administrative noise, a provincial disturbance resolved by local authority. The empire processed thousands of reports like it every year. Most never reached higher attention. But beneath that surface, the system was already unstable. Tiberius's rule was deteriorating into extreme paranoia. Informants operated freely. Accusations replaced governance. Suspicion became structure. In that environment, distance no longer meant safety. It meant vulnerability. Pilate remained in Judea, but the political foundation beneath him was already shifting. The collapse of Sejanus had removed the protective layer above him. Every past connection now carried risk. Every prior alignment could be reinterpreted. And in Rome, reinterpretation is often more dangerous than crime. At the same time, Judea itself was destabilizing. The province was not unified. Competing religious authorities, economic pressure from taxation, fragmenting social structures, all of it created constant friction. Roman governance relied on deterrence, but deterrence only works when stability is believed, and belief was weakening. Pilate's authority existed inside contradiction. He was expected to suppress unrest, while operating inside a system that continuously generated it. Every enforcement risked escalation. Every restraint risked appearing weak. So governance became reactive. Not control, but response. The execution of Jesus was not an isolated decision inside that system. It was a pressure release, a local stabilization attempt inside a structure already under strain. But systems under strain do not resolve. They accumulate, and accumulated pressure does not disappear. It waits. What looked like closure in Judea was actually the beginning of something far longer. something that would not be visible immediately in reports, but would emerge later through shifts in power, leadership change, and institutional memory. Rome does not forget events. It stores them until they become useful again. 4 years after the execution, the center of Roman power shifted. Tiberius died in AD 37. His death did not simply end a reign. It removed the force that had kept the imperial system stable through fear. And in Rome, when stability disappears, everything is reinterpreted. Power does not remain neutral after a transition. It reorganizes. And in that reorganization, past decisions become liabilities. Pilate's position changed immediately. He was no longer operating under Sejanus's shadow system, nor under Tiberius's paranoid equilibrium. He now existed in a new political environment, under Caligula, a young emperor, with no obligation to inherit the logic of the previous decade. In Rome, this is dangerous, because continuity is not guaranteed, and what was once acceptable under one ruler can become punishable under the next. Pilate's actions in Judea were no longer anchored in a stable framework. They were exposed to retrospective judgment. And retrospective judgment is one of the most unpredictable forces in imperial politics. At the same time, Judea itself had not stabilized. The underlying tensions remained unresolved. They had only been contained. And containment is not resolution, it is delay.
Yes, my lord. Which dispatch?
Across the province,
Germania and Gallia.
pressure continued to
At once,
build.
sir. Send them
Economic
to the Senate.
exploitation intensified under successive administrators. Religious authority became increasingly politicized. Local resistance movements began to re-emerge. What had been suppressed was returning. Slowly, but inevitably. Pilate's removal from office was not triggered by a single event. It was the accumulation of many. Political restructuring, administrative complaints, loss of protection networks, and the absence of the system that once justified his position. He was recalled toward Rome, not as a governor, but as a former official whose usefulness had expired. And in the imperial system, expiration is rarely followed by explanation. He disappears from formal record, not erased violently, just no longer required. But the structure that produced him continues, and what remains in his absence is not closure, it is momentum. Pilate's removal did not happen in a courtroom. It did not happen in public. It did not even happen in the form of a clear judgment. It happened the way Rome preferred to correct its own system. Silently. Once summoned back toward the capital, he was no longer a governor, no longer a decision-maker, only a former official moving through a structure that had already moved past him. In Rome, relevance matters more than guilt, and irrelevance is often enough. From this point forward, Pilate begins to disappear from the historical record. Later traditions attempt to place him in exile. Others describe different endings. But within the imperial system itself, there is something simpler at work. If a man no longer holds function, he no longer requires documentation. And without documentation, he no longer exists in the administrative sense of the empire. But Pilate is only one node. The same pressure that removed him continues outward, across other officials, other provinces, other networks tied to earlier decisions. Meanwhile, in Judea, consequences continue unfolding, not as a single event, but as accumulation. The execution in AD 33 was once treated as a local solution, a controlled removal, a stabilizing action. But over time, it becomes part of a longer sequence of instability. Successive governors intensify economic pressure. Administrative systems become more extractive. Social tension deepens instead of resolving. Resistance does not disappear. It adapts. And what adapts does not remain contained forever. It grows. The system that Pilate was meant to stabilize no longer resembles the one that exists later. It has evolved into something less governable, more fragmented, more reactive, and far more volatile. From the Roman perspective, this is not failure. It is escalation, and escalation always demands response, even if that response comes years later. What began as a localized execution is now part of a much larger chain of political pressure, one that no longer belongs to any single actor and cannot be reversed by any single decision. By the time Rome turned its full attention back toward Judea, the situation was no longer administrative. It had already crossed the threshold into open instability. What once functioned as a governed province had fragmented into competing power centers. Authority was no longer unified, it was contested, and contestation inside the Roman system never stays local. It escalates. Rome responded in the only way it ultimately could, not with negotiation, but with military force. A full legion's deployment was authorized under Vespasian, one of the empire's most experienced commanders. His mission was not to restore dialogue, it was to restore control. Judea was no longer a province to be managed. It was a rebellion to be crushed. But by the time Roman forces advanced, the internal structure of the region had already begun to collapse inward. Competing factions inside Jerusalem were no longer focused on resistance alone. They were focused on survival, and survival under pressure often turns inward. Food systems broke down. Supply chains were destroyed. Resources were deliberately burned in internal conflicts. The city began consuming itself before Rome ever reached its walls. What the Roman army encountered was not a unified enemy. It was fragmentation, and fragmentation is more dangerous than resistance, because it does not negotiate. It competes. When Titus later takes command of the siege, the strategy shifts into full encirclement. No entry, no exit, no relief. The city is sealed, and sealing a system under pressure does not stop it. It concentrates it. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorate rapidly. Starvation becomes structural. Order collapses. Violence becomes routine. And internal factions that once opposed Rome now turn against each other. Because when external pressure is absolute, the system finds new targets inside itself. At this point, Rome is no longer simply fighting a rebellion. It is observing the final phase of a system that has already failed internally, and now it only determines how that failure ends, not if. By the final stage of the siege, Jerusalem was no longer a functioning city. It had become a sealed system of collapse. The Roman encirclement ensured that nothing could enter and nothing could leave. Inside the walls, starvation stopped being an emergency and became structure. Food shortages turned into competition. Competition turned into violence, and violence turned inward. The factions that once controlled the city no longer shared a common objective. They competed for survival inside a closed system. Authority disintegrated completely. What remained was not governance, but fragmentation under pressure. The temple, once the center of religious, economic, and political life, became the final focal point of destruction. Control over it shifted repeatedly between competing groups, not as leadership, but as possession. When Roman forces finally breached the inner defenses, resistance collapsed in rapid, chaotic sequences. There was no single moment of defeat, only breakdown. Fire consumed the structure that had defined the city for generations, and with it, the institutional center of an entire system vanished. The destruction of the temple was not only architectural, it was systemic. The remaining population was killed, enslaved, or dispersed. The city was dismantled stone by stone. Structures were leveled, materials removed, and what remained was stripped to prevent any future reconstruction of resistance. What began decades earlier as a localized political execution had expanded into a long chain of escalating consequences. One decision, made under pressure in AD 33, became part of a sequence that outlived every individual involved in it. Roman governors were removed, administrators were erased, local authorities were eliminated or displaced. The system that initiated the action also absorbed its final outcome. But what remained afterward was not resolution, it was transformation. Rome integrated the result into its imperial structure, as it always did. But the region itself was permanently altered, politically, socially, historically, and the chain of events that began with a single execution became, in hindsight, part of a much larger pattern. A pattern where systems do not simply end actions, they extend them, far beyond intention, far beyond control, and far beyond the lifetime of anyone who began them. The decision that was meant to restore order did not end history, it accelerated it.